This is a reading from the book entitled Catholic Prophecy, The Coming Chastisement by Yves Dupont. The end of the world. Christ himself has warned us that no one knows of the day and hour, not even the angels of heaven, but the Father only. Matthew chapter 24, verse 36. It is futile, therefore, to attempt to determine any date for the end of the world. At the same time, however, Christ gave us a number of signs to watch for, and he added, "When you see all these things, know that it is near, even at the door." Matthew chapter 24, verse 33. Now, what are these signs? 1. The gospel shall be preached in the whole world. 2. A universal falling away from the faith. 3. The coming of Antichrist. 4. The return of the Jews to the Holy Land. 5. Widespread disturbances of nature. St. Alphonsus de Liguori enlarges on these signs as follows. 1. The gospel shall be preached freely in the whole world. 2. All the nations of the earth shall fall away from the faith. 3. The Holy Roman Empire shall collapse. 4. Antichrist shall come. 5. Enoch and Elias shall return to preach. 6. The Jews shall return to the Holy Land. 7. The powers of heaven shall be shaken. 8. The stars shall fall from heaven. 9. Widespread earthquakes, tidal waves, lightning, wars, famines, and epidemics shall occur. Now the question is, have any of these signs come to pass already? The answer cannot be definite and clear-cut. It may be asserted that the first two signs are already here. Indeed, the gospel has been preached in every nation, and there is overwhelming evidence of a general falling away from the faith. Yet, it has been, and it may still be, contended that the preaching of the gospel must be absolutely worldwide, and reach every single human being, and not be merely confined to pockets of missionary activity in every nation. It can also be objected that the current faithlessness is not general enough to be applied to the second sign. Indeed, the Church is still very active and influential. Some statesmen are openly professing their Catholic faith. Some governments are wholly or almost wholly Catholic, for example, Spain, Portugal, and Ireland. In my opinion, the two interpretations are valid if given the necessary qualifications. This is so because there are two different stages within the latter days period. The first, heralding the final stage, being of lesser intensity, the final stage bringing about the consummation of the world. To each of these two stages will be the proximate signs of the end. To each of these two stages will the proximate signs of the end apply. Thus we are now about to enter the first stage, the great disaster which is imminent, and which will be followed by a period of peace. So we can already see the signs of its coming. The gospel has been preached in every nation, although imperfectly, and the falling away from the faith is worldwide, yet incomplete. Then the lands of the former Roman Empire will be in a state of utter chaos and anarchy. Communism, a prefiguration of Antichrist, will triumph, but its victory will be as short-lived as that of the Antichrist some 30 years later. The great king-to-be and the holy pontiff will reveal themselves to the world and fight communism, thus prefiguring Enoch and Elias. Stones will fall from heaven. Earthquakes and tidal waves will wreak havoc throughout the world. Famines and epidemics will be widespread. Thus will come the end of the first stage, or the Good Friday of Christendom. The resurrection will be spectacular. The great king will be the emperor of Western Europe, and anointed by the Holy Pontiff. Many Jews and all non-Catholic Christians will turn to the true faith. The Mohammedans will embrace Christianity, as also the Chinese. In short, virtually the whole world will be Catholic. This universal preaching of the gospel, in turn, will constitute the first sign of the second stage. Toward the end of the great king's reign, people will fall away from the faith, the second sign. Then the Holy Roman Empire will collapse, third sign. Antichrist will come, fourth sign. Enoch and Elias will be sent down again in order to fight Antichrist, fifth sign. The Jews will return to Palestine, sixth sign. New disturbances of nature will take place, seventh, eighth, and ninth signs. The personal This personal interpretation of mine is based on my knowledge of a large number of private prophecies, and on extensive and painstaking cross-references and correlations made many years ago when I was in a position to devote much time to studying these prophecies. Moreover, this interpretation is not incompatible with Scripture. Indeed, Scripture supports it in many cases. We read in the Gospel, for instance, a description of various evils followed by the caution, "But the end is not yet." Matthew chapter 24, verse 6. And again a description of pestilences, famines, and earthquakes with the conclusion, but these things are the beginnings of sorrows. Matthew chapter 24, verse 8. The first stage only. Then we are told that the gospel is to be preached in the whole world. Matthew chapter 24, verse 14, before the end finally comes. In verse 15, another description of these events is given, but it is clear that verses 9 to 14 formed an indivisible whole, as did verses 4 to 8. Then, at the end of the third passage, verses 15 to 22, we are informed again that those days will be shortened for the sake of the elect, otherwise no living creature would be saved. For the above reasons, I regard it as certain that there will be two different stages. The first stage will only be the beginning of sorrows, and it will be shortened for the sake of the elect. And the gospel will then be preached throughout the world. This will be the period of peace under the great monarch, the period of conversions and general prosperity, which we and our children may enjoy. In short, the period of peace promised by Our Lady of Fatima. Four. Nostradamus. 75. Michael de Notre Dame, Michael of Our Lady, known as Nostradamus. Nostradamus was born in the south of France in 1503, where he studied the humanities. He obtained his doctorate in philosophy and medicine at the age of 26. Later, he was appointed advisor and personal physician to the kings of France, a post which he retained through the reigns of Henry II, Francis II, and Charles IX. A member of the Third Order of St. Francis, he enjoyed the friendship of Pope Pius IV. He was a devout Catholic all his life, and he died in 1566. I make no apologies for quoting Nostradamus. I am aware, of course, that he is not regarded very highly by some of the more educated people in this part of the world, although he enjoys considerable popularity among lovers of sensationalism. This unfortunate state of affairs has been brought about by the shameless commercial exploitation of his works. In point of fact, however, Nostradamus was an authentic seer, and in the old world, many an erudite has not deemed it beneath his dignity to spend long hours poring over his predictions. The list of lay and clerical authors who have written books on Nostradamus over the last 150 years is quite impressive, and I once knew a medical specialist of high renown, a man of great learning, who, now deceased, wrote at least 3 books on the prophecies of Nostradamus. His familiarity with the Greek and Latin languages and with the dialect of southern France enabled him to decipher many of the most obscure of Nostradamus's coined words. Yes, I have every reason indeed to regard Nostradamus as a genuine seer. I know that Dr. Rumble of Sydney would not agree with me, and Dr. Rumble is quite an erudite too, on par with some of the clerical writers I have just mentioned. But, however great his erudition, Dr. Rumble had to specialize in breadth of knowledge rather than in depth. This was required by his very function as a radio replies man. No one could possibly answer such diverse questions as he was asked without having at his disposal a good library of reference books. But once you consult a work of reference, you have to take it at its face value. You have to take at its face value the information given therein. On controverted questions, this is unreliable. Although a pygmy compared to the intellectual giant that Dr. Rumble is, I, on the other hand, became acquainted with Nostradamus not less than 32 years ago, and feel entitled to say without exaggeration that I know the man and his works, not only the man and his works, but also a number of the works that have been written about him. This necessary introduction being made, here now are some of his prophecies. 75.1. 4.5. Libra shall see the Hesperides reign. Of heaven and earth shall hold the monarchy, not to perish under any Asian forces until 7 in rank have held the hierarchy. Comment. A bad start, you may say. It is unintelligible. Not really so, however, once you are fully acquainted with Nostradamus' symbolism. The Hesperides garden is that fabulous land of plenty, west of Gibraltar, from which Hercules brought back to Greece the golden apples. That land is the United States, and the above quatrain, interpreted, should read thus: under the sign of Libra, America shall reign, shall hold power in the sky and on land, shall never perish under Asian forces until 7 pontificates have passed. Comment. As a great world power, the USA began its reign during the First World War, but it was not the greatest world power. In 1918, that was France. In 1945, however, the USA was by and large the greatest world power. I think it is from the reign of Pius XII that the 7 pontificates must be counted. And this brings us to the last pope, according to St. Malachi's list. Then, when the world will end. It is debatable, of course, whether the USA is still the leading world power. The inane policies of the Washington politicians since 1945 have been quite successful in lowering U.S. prestige and influence, and the Vietnam War seems to suggest that the giant has feet of clay. However, it must be borne in mind that the Washington politicians have never really wanted to win the Vietnam War. That war could have been won within a few months if the U.S. Army had been allowed to land in North Vietnam. Finally, in the unlikely event of an all-out war with Soviet Russia, I am inclined to think that the U.S. would prove the stronger of the two. The greatest weakness of the U.S. is moral corruption, but miraculously, when an all-out war erupts, people pull themselves up by the bootstraps and forget about drugs and sex. On the other hand, the greatest weakness of Soviet Russia is internal discontent, and when a global war breaks out, the dissenters, far from rallying around the government, may seize this unique opportunity to revolt. We saw this during World War II, when whole Russian armies, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, defected to the Germans and were anxious to liberate their homeland under the leadership of their general, Vlasov. To my mind, this is why Soviet Russia is so careful in its dealings with the U.S. They just do not relish the prospect of a global war. And if the Washington political careerists had taken this into account since 1945, it is fairly certain that communism would now be a thing of the past, without any war. The history of post-war U.S. diplomacy is a story of missed opportunities. I must be pardoned for elaborating on the subject, but this study in prophecy would lose its significance, in fact, might become irrelevant, if I did not examine the political context of the period to which these prophecies refer. So let me explain a little further the story of missed opportunities. In 1945, the U.S. was the only nuclear power in the world. When the Soviets decided on the Berlin blockade, what did the U.S. do? At great expense, it organized an air bridge, whereas the only logical answer worthy of the leading nation was to force the way with tanks through the blockade. No, there would have been no war. The Russians could not afford it, but their loss of prestige in the satellite countries would have been tremendous, and the consequences for them would have been incalculable. Next came the Korean War. General MacArthur had a plan to finish it quickly, a plan that would have, in the process, brought to its knees the rising power of communist China. But Washington opposed it and recalled MacArthur, as a reward for his genius, no doubt. In 1956, there was Hungary. After the popular uprising, the Russian tanks left the country and remained poised for several days on the other side of the border, waiting to see what action the U.S. would take. Meantime, the newly formed Hungarian government asked the U.S. for support, which was refused, and they then approached several European countries. Spain offered to send a few planes, but refueling facilities were required in West Germany. West Germany did grant, or was about to grant, these facilities when the U.S. stepped in and threatened West Germany with economic sanctions. Bonn had to back down. Result, the Russian tanks poured back into Hungary and crushed the uprising in a bloodbath. Is it the end of the missed opportunities? Not in the least, but I cannot review them all. Yalta, Poland, East Germany, the Middle East, Cuba, Laos, Vietnam, Czechoslovakia. The list is long indeed. And except in these last few years, the risk of all-out war with Russia was non-existent. Even now, this risk is minimal if the Washington politicians would but allow the U.S. Army to show its teeth. Back now to Nostradamus. He foresaw the Age of Enlightenment and the subsequent development of the printed word, which man is using to boast of his achievements. It is to be noted that in his time, printed books were still comparatively few. 75.2. Letters will do such great and unequaled boasting. He foresaw the development of radiology, and as his apposition of rare metals and waves makes clear, the development of nuclear power, a thing which was undreamed of in his time. 75.3. The complete transformation of incorruptible metals and mysterious waves, that is, plutonium and gamma and beta rays. He foresaw the decadence of the spiritual and temporal powers, the church and the secular governments, modern irreligion, and the general revolt against authority. Plus, he foresaw that the church would be affected first. Indeed, it is only within the last 20 years that anarchy has been spreading, whereas irreligion began in the 18th century. 75.4. Momentous and painful events, calamitous adventures are drawing close. First, the temples of the Lord, then those whose power is on earth, when the enemies of Jesus Christ shall begin to multiply. He also foresaw much of what the other prophecies mention. 75.5. I find that learning shall be at a great loss, and that so many great floods shall happen before the universal conflagration, that there shall scarcely be any land that shall not be covered with water. And this shall last so long, that except for what lives on mountains and in waters, all shall perish. Before and after these floods, however, there shall be such scarcity of rain, and such a great deal of fire and burning stones shall fall from heaven, that nothing unconsumed shall remain. The world shall be so diminished, and so few men shall be left on earth, that not enough will be found to plough the fields, and these will stay in fallow as long as they had once been tilled. He gave the correct date when the Christian calendar was abolished in France. It was restored later by Napoleon I. 75.6. And it shall be in the year 1792, which will be thought to be a renewal of time. He foresaw the rise of authoritarian regimes in Italy, Germany, and Spain. Mussolini assumed power in 1922, Hitler in 1933, Franco in 1938. 75.7. And 3 regions shall be over a wide extent of leagues, namely the Roman, the German, and the Spanish. They shall be equal in nature, but much different in faith. There is another passage that should be inserted before the last sentence above, but it is practically impossible to translate it satisfactorily, as the sense is quite obscure. However, it clearly refers to a war, and to 2 or 3 countries, by indicating the nearest latitude of their capital cities. Thus, 48 degrees for Paris, although it should really be 49, 50 degrees for Prague, 52 degrees for London, Berlin, and Warsaw. It goes on to say that the first areas, 50 degrees and 52 degrees, will be the first to tremble, followed by the western, the southern, and the eastern, in that order. Indeed, Prague and Warsaw were the first to tremble, March 1939 and September 1939. Then came Paris, May 1940. Greece, October 1940. Russia, June 1941. It could not have been more accurate, yet it is impossible to reconstruct this passage, which is a jumble of verbs, nouns, and adjectives with no apparent connection. This obscurity, of course, is deliberate. In 9 different passages at least, Nostradamus explains that it is not expedient to be too specific, and that he has roughed up his original vaticinations so that they might be passed by the ecclesiastical censor. But, he says, I could have given the dates for every event which my prophetical instinct enabled me to see, because I have worked out all the dates through astrological calculations. Nostradamus had a natural gift of clairvoyance, coming from God. Of course, as all things come from God, but not immediately inspired by God. Moreover, he was a scientist and an accomplished scholar. Astrology had no secrets for him, and it is his knowledge of astrology that enabled him to find out the dates. He gives precisions about this in 12 different passages. Astrology is, to the mind of modern man, a superstition, but it was not so in the past. In those so-called Dark Ages, which in his foolish pride modern man derides, astrology was then held in high esteem by men such as Galileo and St. Thomas Aquinas. It is only comparatively recently that rationalistic philosophers and scientists decided that there was nothing but superstition in astrology, although to be sure a great deal of what is currently presented as astrology is just that. Yet, some 15 years ago in Paris, a group of biologists and radiologists established experimentally that the sun and the moon did influence some biological processes. And since the exercise of our free will depends on our thinking power, which in turn rests on biological processes, it is not hard to see that the stars may indeed have a bearing on the future of mankind. Let us consider another passage on the Second World Wars. I'm having trouble believing this passage. Astrology does not affect human thinking, in my opinion, but it's a good way of tracking time, definitely. 75.8. Italy, emulating ancient Rome, will raise great armies and put her wings high in the sky, plains. And at that time, great Byzantine sails, the British fleet based in the Middle East, with the help and power of Aquila, the American eagle, shall meet the liguistics, Italians, and hinder them, so that the two Cretans, the perfidious ones, Hitler and Mussolini, shall not keep their faith. In the sea there shall be great commotion, beginning in the Pan-Potam, Sicily, to the European Mesopotamia, Italy, at 45, and others from 41, 42, and 37. Comment. This passage would have been incomprehensible before the events it describes, but not so now. Pan-Potam means Sicily, because this coined word means in effect island. European Mesopotamia means Italy, because the word means peninsula in Greek. The figures 45, 41, 42, and 37 are degrees of latitude, and so this passage can be explicated as follows. Italy will emulate ancient Rome. She will raise great armies and put her planes in the sky, but the British fleet of the Middle East, supported by the Americans, will confront the Italians, with the result that Italy and Germany will not keep their faith. There will be great activity at sea. It will begin in Sicily, where the Americans under Patton and the English under Montgomery landed in July 1943. It will then be carried to the mainland of Italy. All this is strictly correct. The Anglo-Americans landed in Sicily, first 37 degrees of latitude, then on the mainland at Naples and Salerno between 41 and 42 degrees latitude, where bloody fighting took place. Finally, the war ended when the Allies had reached the north of Italy, 45 degrees. Meantime, and even before the Salerno landing took place, the Italians had broken their faith with Germany, 6 days before exactly, so that the 5th American Army of General Clark was confronted not by Italian troops, but by German troops under Rommel and Kesselring. Let us now turn to Nostradamus' prophecies of events yet to come. As the above passage has shown, it is extremely difficult to interpret Nostradamus' predictions before the events. Once the events have come to pass, however, some significant details always make it possible to identify the passage concerned. Regarding the future, therefore, all one can do is to give an outline and qualify any possible interpretation of details by means of a question mark. This goes on for a long time. 75.9. After this, the barren female, the revolution, more powerful than the second Russian revolution, shall be received in two countries. The first, obstinate, which used to rule all the others, England. The second and the third, which shall deploy its forces in Eastern Europe, shall be defeated in Pannonia, Hungary, but shall send its navy to Sicily and to the east coast of Italy before being soundly defeated in Italy and in Germany. Comment. The second is probably Italy, where the revolution will be raging according to many prophecies. The third will not be in the throes of a revolution. It is the Arab world, the southern ally of Russia, as Nostradamus says elsewhere. The Mohammedans will take advantage of the complete anarchy prevailing in Western Europe and proclaim a new holy war. They will be armed by Soviet Russia, who will endeavor not to become involved directly, at least not in the beginning. 75:10. And in that time and in these countries the powers of hell shall set up against the church of Jesus Christ, the might of the enemies of his law. This will be the second Antichrist, and he will persecute the church and its true vicar through the power of temporal rulers who in their ignorance shall have been deceived by high-sounding words that will do more harm than a sword in the hands of a madman. And this shall last until the appearance of him who is of noble birth, and whose time shall have come. Some unintelligible details follow this. Comment. Here the role of Russia is clearly outlined. No direct involvement, but her propaganda will deceive many foreign rulers, ignorant of the true purpose and nature of communism. And this will last until the appearance of the great king to be. As we have seen earlier, Russia will finally intervene directly, but will be defeated by the great king with the help of God. Soviet Russia is called the second Antichrist. In fact, there will be only one Antichrist properly so called, and he will come at the end of the great king's reign. But according to Nostradamus, two others will come before, who can be called Antichrist figuratively. The first Antichrist was either Hitler or Napoleon. Let us recall here that Nostradamus calls Napoleon the first son of the revolution. Likewise, he calls the Russian Revolution the second revolution. It seems likely then that the first Antichrist was Napoleon, who forcibly brought back to France the popes of his time and cast them into jail, Pius VI and Pius VII. Surely a temporal ruler who lays his hands on the Vicar of Christ is an Antichrist by that very act. Note, too, the reference to the true Vicar of Christ, which seems to imply that there will be a false one, or an anti-pope.